Welcome to the second installment of this webinar series on reporting on the SDGs. This webinar follows the successful launch of the guide on SDG reporting for universities and colleges in October 2023. My name is Joana Kagayo, and I work for Universities Canada as the Program Officer for the Climate Initiative. And I am joined today by my colleague, Sandra Boisvert, and our partners, Joana Morenike from SDSN Canada at the University of Waterloo, and Judy from College and Institutes Canada. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the history of this land, on the lens on which we gather before getting into the webinar content. Universities Canada and College Institutes acknowledge that our offices located in Ottawa are on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We recognize the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. We honor their long history and welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory, and uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation. SDSN Canada is located at the University of Waterloo, whose campuses are on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, land promised to 6 nations, which includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Further, we respect and affirm and inherit the treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across this land, and will continue to honor its commitments to self-determination and sovereignty we have made to Indigenous nations and peoples. I invite everyone to reflect today on the place from which you are joining from and the relationship with that land, and share in the chat where you are joining us today. If you'd like to learn more about Indigenous territories, languages, lands, and ways of life, please visit the nativeland.ca website that Morenike has put in the chat. Before passing the floor to Morenike, I wanted to thank everyone for attending today. As some of you may know, in 2020, Universities Canada embarked on a pan-Canadian initiative to increase awareness of the SDG projects on Canadian campuses and strengthen cross-university and university community collaborations. This work continues with a renewed focus on climate through our Canada Universities Action for Net Zero initiative, which focuses on SDG 13 climate action. Through our Actions for Net Zero initiative, Universities Canada is working to support and accelerate our members' climate work, and to bring a coordinated national approach by measuring and reporting on their climate impact, advocating on the necessary federal supports, and providing a central place for sharing and collaboration. As we mentioned at our last webinar, we are in the final stages of our national cross-country climate workshop series, with the final workshop taking place at the University of Alberta and at the end of March, and a virtual one in early April. Later this month, we will be releasing a report which gathers data that has been collected from our climate and infrastructure survey. Today is a busy day as we are hosting our annual Accelerate conference in Ottawa, where we have invited thought leaders to discuss issues such how we can address the housing crisis while advancing broader climate goals, and how universities can tackle systematic challenges in our healthcare sector. It is our pleasure to help organize today's webinar with SDSN Canada and CICAN to dive further into best practices, useful tools to start or deepen institutions' SDG reporting work. Today's conversation will take place in English, only with a subsequent webinar to be held in French later this month. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joana, and welcome everyone. My name is Morenike Ojurongbe, and I'm with SDSN Canada, and I'll be moderating the session today. As Joana was talking, I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone joining us as we continue to explore best practices and explore useful tools for igniting institutional approaches in reporting on the SDGs. As earlier said, this is the second iteration of this webinar series for a report that was launched in 2023. And if this is your first time joining us for this webinar, welcome. We'll be putting the link in the chat box for you to see how Canadian post-secondary institutions have approached reporting on the SDGs so far. With that said, I'll have a quick run through of the agenda today. We'll be having a conversation with our panelists for about 30 to 40 minutes, and thereafter we'll open up the floor for questions from our audience. As the conversation is going on, we encourage you to please put your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box, and so that it doesn't get lost as we go on today. We have an interesting line of speakers, and it's my pleasure to welcome Jason Enns. He's the Executive Director, Strategic Initiatives at Concordia University. We also have Amy Spark, who is a climate specialist, Poole Valley College. And last and certainly not the least, I'm pleased to welcome Wendy Gómez, a research analyst and proposal development officer at the University of Waterloo. Welcome to all our panelists today. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts as we start this conversation about reporting on the SDGs and the different approaches your institutions have taken in reporting on the SDGs. And I'll start off with you, Jason. Just a handful of colleges and universities across Canada have looked through to the 17-room exercise. And that's such a unique model because it allows for institutions to convene their campus community to kind of discuss each of the SDGs per room and then lead to a collective action. So can you take us through your thought process as to why you decided to go the route of a 17-room exercise and the significance of that exercise within Concordia University?
Sure thing. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about Concordia's work and really welcome the hearing perspectives from others here today about what they're doing and have considered doing next in their campus journeys. So the context at Concordia is that this 17 rooms exercise was one component of a voluntary university review at Concordia, which, as folks may know, is an SDG-oriented form of institutional self-assessment. The motivation was really to move beyond just simply inventorying and relabeling our activities using the SDGs to really figure out what are our priorities and what's our vision. Just in short, the 17 rooms format was developed by the Brookings Institution and the Rockefeller Foundation as a way to host conversations about each of the individual SDGs in order to foster new collaborations and connections between various actors in the field related to that SDG. The exercise is run in different ways at various universities and other places. We ran ours over the course of a semester, spring 2022, with approximately one session each week. Each session was about 2 hours long. All of these sessions were held online, and participants were sent a participant guide in advance, which included information on current university activities related to that SDG, some bibliometric assessments that we had done, UN targets, and some examples of work at other institutions related to that SDG. And then during the session, we reviewed what was currently happening on our campuses, looked at the UN targets related to that SDG, and then really opened up the conversation to ask, what might we do to have greater impact in relation to this particular SDG based on what was happening on our campus already? And then we capped this all off with what we called the 18th room exercise, which was to kind of validate and identify some cross-cutting takeaways from that work. And after I present, I'll put a link in the chat to those takeaways, just so folks can see what those kind of transversal outcomes were of our exercise. None of those things were particularly novel or new to us, but the SDG work allowed us to kind of pull those threads together and really generate some attention and spur some follow through on those kind of takeaways. And with respect to the significance of that exercise for us, it moved us beyond just taking an inventory of current activities and placing SDG icons on a lot of different things that we're already doing. And it pushed us to identify our aspirations and priorities and develop develop an actual impact agenda for our university. So if you invite me back in 6 months, I can share that agenda because it's not publicly circulating yet. But it really was, the 17 rooms exercise really was the prod for us to form that agenda, as opposed to just trying to do everything everywhere all the time for all of the SDGs in a distributed way. So I'll pause there and let the other folks share the work on their own campuses.
Thank you so much for that, Jason. And I think one thing that stood out for me was the 18th room. That's kind of new, but I like the idea that you that helped you, Concordia University, focus on what the priorities and what the vision was and its impact. And I think that's great, because universities and colleges need to begin to see their roles beyond their immediate community to more like a global outlook. And I think that's fantastic. But before we go on to the next person, Jason, I think one thing that struck me was, how were you able to get folks into the room together? Were you able to, selecting people, based on their various work on campus, or was it like a call for anyone interested to kind of
we deliberated on that question for quite a while, and we took a kind of semi-curated approach. We identified about a little bit over 200 people across our campus whose work seemed to have an SDG alignment, either because of the thematic nature of their work, the themes that they worked on, or their kind of orientation to do community engagement or global kind of work. Sent out a broad invitation and let them identify which SDG conversation they wanted to be a part of. So we did some self-selection, but on the other hand, we also let people identify, rather than trying to predict which conversation they were most likely to want to be a part of, we let them self-identify for that.
Yeah, perfect. That sounds great. And I'm sure we would have a lot of questions, but just moving on to Amy. I know Bow Valley College has been doing tremendous work in integrating the SDGs into the sustainability report. And I think that's fantastic, because what we try to advocate with this guide is to let post-secondary institutions use what they already have, not reinvent the wheel. Start from where you are. How can you integrate the SDGs on your campus based on the tools that are available to you? So can you take us through why you decided to integrate the SDGs into your sustainability report, and what your thought process was when you were doing that exercise?
Absolutely. And thanks so much for the invitation to share today. Just to sort of introduce myself and kind of place where the work is happening. So Bow Valley College is located just 2 or 3 blocks away from the confluence of the Bow and Elbow Rivers in Treaty 7 territory, also known as Calgary. And I am the climate specialist, so I work within the sustainability office within the campus services team, so the facilities team. And I just want to sort of say right off the bat, I think a bit of a disclaimer, and I have somewhat of an uneasy relationship with the SDGs, or I would say a complicated relationship with the SDGs, and that I think we all know there's a lot of critiques that can be made about how the SDGs were came about, but also sort of maybe some of the conflicting messaging that comes through with the SDGs, like the goal, decent work and economic growth. Can we really have constant economic growth and meet all of the other goals? So I just wanted to put that out there, because I think those critiques are really important as we have conversations about reporting. And I think also a lot of the value in the SDGs is actually those conversations about, are these an appropriate goal for the future? Who developed them? Whose voices are left out of those conversations? So I just wanted to say that disclaimer off the top. But and I would say I'm really excited to hear about the work at Concordia. I feel like this idea of sort of collaborative or interdisciplinary work is really exciting. The work we've been doing at Bow Valley, I would say, is much more concentrated within the campus services team. So we've been writing an annual sustainability report that focuses mostly on social and environmental sustainability, just because of where we're housed within the institution. Really, we're sort of responsible for the environmental portfolio of the college. But it has been really beneficial in terms of an engagement piece. So in 2018, we started to align the report with the SDGs. And then starting on, I believe in 2019, we started aligning the report specifically to the targets underneath. the SDGs, the international targets. I believe there's 169 across the 17 goals. And then in 2020, in addition to those international targets, we started aligning the work to the Canadian ambitions, which are just essentially Canadian specific targets. So that probably sounds really dry. I actually promise it's not that dry of a process, and it didn't take that long. That's kind of, I guess, my biggest message today is that really looking at those individual targets underneath the goals was probably the most valuable thing for us, because they help, at least personally, bring those goals to life. So one example I like to reference is SDG 13, climate action. Of course, that's a huge bucket of work, but I believe it's the Canadian ambition 13.1 that says to equip Canadians to be resilient in the face of climate change. And to me, that just provides a story that's so much more specific to our context that we can actually work on. So I would say the thought process has been changing over time as to, should we even align with the SDGs? I decided that yes, I think it's actually a pretty good engagement tool. And then over time, getting more and more detail as to which targets we're actually looking at. And then also just really focusing on what's the action that's coming out of this reporting, right? So are we just reporting for the sake of reporting because we think it's the right thing to do? Or is the reporting guiding our decisions in terms of the actions that we want to take on campus?
Yeah.
I'll leave it there. Sorry.
No worries at all, Amy. And thank you so much for that. I think I think it was such a smart move not to just look at the SDGs in the broader sense of it, but kind of dig deeper into the targets and indicators, because I think one of the arguments has always been, on the surface level, the SDGs don't apply to universities or colleges. So digging deeper into targets might actually just help a bit better with that. And I think that was just a fantastic idea. But thank you so much, Amy. And just moving on a bit to Wendy. And I know when I first heard the word bibliometric mapping, I was scared. I was wondering what kind of term is that? And could you take us through what it entails? And I know a number of us here might not have utilized that tool at all. And could you just take us through the exercise and how you conducted bibliometric mapping? But just before you say that, speak to that, Wendy. Wendy will be speaking more generally about a different analysis and not the one referenced under the University of Waterloo's case study in the guide, which was conducted by another unit in Waterloo. But please go ahead, Wendy. Help us understand what bibliometric mapping is all about.
Sure. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about this exercise. I do have to say, this is pretty much a purely quantitative exercise, although bibliometric mapping doesn't have to be purely quantitative, but this exercise was. So the kind of background around the exercise was the university was conducting different types of analysis related to publications and research at the university as they were related to the SDGs. But none of the research that was done was specific to the different faculties at the university. So it was being done at a very broad level, a university-wide level, which is great. And that's amazing. And that's great to get baseline information. But I was asked to do an exercise by the faculty deans. We have 6 faculties here. And the deans really wanted to get an understanding of their own tenure track faculty members and how their faculties were contributing to the SDG targets in relation to research publications. So the whole exercise was focused about outputs of research publications only. So there wasn't any sort of qualitative information included. With this objective in mind, to really break down the SDG publications that were coming out of the different faculties, we set about mapping the faculty contributions to the SDG research publications, specifically between the years of 2014 and 2018. Now, these years were chosen because the University of Waterloo had done very well in the 2020 Times Higher Education Impact Ranking, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And in fact, for this year, we ranked 16th overall out of 768 institutions that were ranked, and we were second in Canada. So there was a desire for us to really break down kind of what that ranking might look like as far as research. So for the research variables in the THE ranking, what they use to calculate the scoring are three different measures. One's called the Field Weighted Citation Index of papers related to each SDG, the number of publications related to each SDG, and then the proportion of all research papers that are co-authored with low-income countries. So we kind of took those baseline metrics that are used in the overall ranking and we adjusted them a little bit for our exercise. So for our exercise, we were interested in looking specifically at the volume of publications coming out of each tenure track faculty list for each faculty on each SDG. And then we were looking at 4 measures of research excellence. So which SDGs did each faculty have the most citations in? Which SDGs did each faculty have the highest field-weighted citation impact in? And then which SDG publications did they have the highest percentage of publications in the top 1% most cited publications? So in order to do this, we used 4 different steps. Actually, we used 6 different steps. The first step was obtaining a list from each faculty of their tenure track faculty members for 2019 and 2020. So this in itself had some issues because if we're looking at publications from 2014 to 2018 and we're using a 2019-2020 faculty list, there's going to be some discrepancy there, but we were using the best information we had at the time. Then we used this list and we found everyone's Scopus ID. So if there were faculty members who didn't have a Scopus ID, they weren't included in this analysis. And because they didn't have a way for us to identify their publications. If a faculty member had multiple Scopus IDs, those multiple Scopus IDs were included. We created a Boolean search string in Scopus, and we added all the Scopus IDs for each faculty member and ran a search for publications between 2014 and 2018. And we repeated this for each faculty so that we had 6 different searches with the IDs. And then we obtained the Elsevier SDG search strings version 2020 and ran the search for each SDG in Scopus. Then we used a combined search. So we had the faculty ID lists and then we combined those with each SDG. So we actually had 96 combined searches that were exported into SciVal. And we made sure that they were identified correctly. And then in SciVal, we used a really interesting feature they have called benchmarking. So in this benchmarking interface, you can benchmark multiple metrics using a tab at the same time and then export everything out into Excel. So once we exported all the data, we filtered out publications that didn't have a Waterloo affiliation on them. And then we had basically our research metrics. So I'm going to show you a little bit more at the end about what the output actually looked like, but that's kind of a high-level overview of what we did.
Thank you for that, Wendy. And for anyone like me that might not know what a Scopus ID is, can you take us through briefly how to obtain one and other available softwares?
Yeah, sure. So a Scopus ID is automatically assigned to any researcher who creates at least one publication within a journal that is owned by Elsevier. So Elsevier indexes, I think it's at least 96,000, has 96,000 journals indexed. So the likelihood that you're going to be publishing in a journal that's owned by is included in Elsevier's database is very high. You don't have to apply for a Scopus ID. You just automatically signed one once you publish one paper. Okay. So that ID is followed with you on every publication. So it becomes kind of like your social insurance number in research publications for Elsevier publications anyways.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that, Wendy. So now moving on to the other questions we had. Could you just take us through what one of the key outcomes for you while reporting on the SDGs in terms of bibliometric mapping? What is that one key outcome that people should be aware of when they want to conduct a bibliometric mapping exercise?
Yeah, I think it was really interesting in this exercise that the deans got to really see at a very minute level where the publications were coming from. And even at the faculty member level, they could quickly identify faculty member names on the SDG related publications. it was a really good way for them to get an understanding of research in their different faculties and where they were having strengths as in relation to the SDGs, and weaknesses as well. Like, for example, in engineering, it became very clear that we had basically no publications in quite a few areas. So we didn't have publications in no poverty. We didn't have publications on quality education. We didn't have publications in gender. Like, it was very clear where there were deficiencies. And so it gave the deans a good high level, first kind of shot perspective on SDG research.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. And I think that makes the tool very, fantastic, because it can kind of streamline which SDG has more publication than the other, and then the department or the deans can kind of work towards that. So that sounds great. Amy, I'm just going to move on to you now, and I'm just thinking that one thing that stood out for me with your report was that you didn't just create a report for the sake of it. You kind of thought through, how do you engage, how does the campus community engage with the report and with the SDGs? And then you created stuff like scavenger hunt, which that was a very brilliant idea. Could you just tell us one key element for you that kind of stood out with this reporting approach? For me, that the scavenger hunt was brilliant. But for you, in your own perspective, what was that one thing, two things that you think folks should take away when they're looking at integrating the SDGs into their sustainability reporting?
Well, I think the word you used was brilliant, which I cannot take credit for. Unfortunately, that was my colleague, Megan Hardman, who's actually now at the University of Alberta. She was with Bow Valley College at the time, but a shout out to Megan because the scavenger hunt was her idea. This was, of course, in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. The height of pandemic. And so we were trying to find a way to sort of engage the campus community in this online PDF report, which can be quite dry. And I think not a lot of people are going to pick up a report to read for light reading. So the idea was essentially to come up with sort of 10 questions about the report that you would have to read the report in order to know the answer. And then we put it out to students, and if people submitted answers to those 10 questions, then they got entered to win a prize draw. And they also got recognition on their co-curricular record for engaging with the sustainability report. And it was just really exciting to kind of see how proud some of the students became of, like, oh, I didn't know we were doing that as an institution. And I think that's really the value in this type of reporting is, I guess, making people feel proud of the work that we are doing, because a lot of work is happening behind the scenes that students and faculty and staff don't see, but also kind of pushing us to do better, right? So sometimes students would say, like, oh, hey, I noticed that there's like a bike cage in the parkade, but it's not open to students. So why can't we park our bikes there? Excuse me. And now a few years later, we do have 2 bike cages available for students. So I think that's really the value in, like, engagement, so that we educate, but also pushing us to do better.
Thank you so much for that, Wendy and Amy. And I think that also just would push me into my question to Jason. That idea of seeing what each person is doing on campus, it's very valid. With the 17 rooms, did you experience that when you were able to put people in different rooms on different SDGs? Were they able to kind of see commonalities in their work on the SDGs?
Yeah, I think that was a positive outcome, and we haven't yet realized all the potential that had come out of that. But we, in conjunction with running this 17 Rooms program, we did create a new seed granting program in our Office of Research that specifically asked or invited the formation of new teams focused on an SDG related theme, and then had a kind of an impact pathway forward. How are they trying to, like, extrapolate and build on this small collaboration that they would build together? And we had really great uptake based on that. And it's really one of the really positive outcomes of that 17 Rooms exercise, getting people in a creative space, thinking about what the aspirations and the potential is, and then creating a mechanism to help them get started on that work together.
Yeah.
I think, one, York University, I see Nicole Arsenault is part of the conversation in York. Super admiration for York with their interdisciplinary cluster program that put a whole bunch of funding behind that work, and we're doing it in a very small way, but I think that's a really positive outcome of 17 Rooms isn't a reporting kind of exercise, but it's a using the SDG framework as a way to spotlight what are both the deficiencies or gaps, but what are also the potential opportunities for us to work together and draw on different capacities at the institution to really advance and be more impactful as an institution in relation to the SDG goals.
Mm-hmm. And I think that sounds really great, because being able to see the gaps and opportunities for growth and impact, I think that's a fantastic model. I'll just quickly state again, please, if you have any questions, please put them in your Q&A box and not in the chat box or function. So just moving on, with so many people in this room, we have a diverse audience, and people might be on different levels on their reporting journey. Some might just be starting off, some might be midway through. But could you, if you had that one advice for each person, irrespective of where they are right now, what would be that one advice or two that you think they can begin to take towards reporting on the SDGs? And I'll start off with you, Wendy. Is that what, in terms of bibliometric mapping, is there one advice that people can take towards their first steps on bibliometric mapping?
Sure. I was just replying to someone in the chat, so I'll get back to you about how you. Oh. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Sorry.
Sorry, we just had an emergency alert come across. I did have it come across my screen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just give me 1 second here. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think advice for bibliometric mapping, I think a word of caution. I think the first thing that you need to understand if you go about doing bibliometric mapping is that you're going to miss a lot of amazing things that aren't included in SDG search strings or are not included in Scopus IDs. So for example, we have a School of Architecture here, and they do amazing work related to sustainability. Some of their amazing projects wouldn't be captured in a bibliometric exercise. Why? For one, they're not related to research publications. Specifically, they could be books and they're not indexed in Scopus. You could have projects that don't have any publications attached to them at all. A lot of great projects in, Faculty of Arts don't have research publications as the end goal. So we could have a lot of amazing research projects going on that don't have a publication as their main impact, a way to determine impact. And for example, you could have a project that has amazing relationships to the SDGs, no research publications, but has amazing policy impact in other ways. And none of those would be captured in a bibliometric analysis like this. So it's a very narrow way to categorize faculty member research and research in general as it relates to the SDGs. So with that caveat, I would say, I think it's a good exercise to do. I think it's an interesting exercise to do. It takes a lot of analytic skills to do it correctly. But I think it's a way that you can actually see in our case, which faculty members are doing research related to the SDGs. And a lot of those faculty members don't even know that they're doing research related to the SDGs. And that's the beauty of it, is that you can see names coming out of this analysis and you're like, oh, wow, their publications are being categorized in this SDG. They don't even know that. So kind of the next step for this analysis was for the deans to take this information back and somehow make it known to their faculty members that they knew, that their publication outputs were having relationships to the SDGs. So I think that's the beauty of it. I think strictly looking at the numbers, comparatively, and I can show you our dashboard after at the end, it's interesting, it's fun to play around with, but you really need to think about what the numbers mean and what you're going to what you're going to use them for, sort of what we talked about at the beginning. And I think if it's a knowledge building exercise, that's good. If it's an exercise to see which faculty members are producing publications on the SDGs and then tell the faculty members, hey, look, you know, your publications are being categorized. I think it's good that way. But as I said, you'll be missing a lot of amazing research that's just not going to be there in this bibliometric exercise.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Wendy, I was just thinking here that something that has always come up for us at SDSN is not having enough faculty members knowing about the SDGs. And I think that's what makes this tool very valuable, because then they can categorically see that their research over time has been, you know, focused on one particular SDG or two. And I think that's very useful for the campus community and for faculty members. And I think by the very end, we'll be very much happy to see your analysis, and then folks can kind of get a better sense of applying what you have said, you know, and say more visually. And Amy, are there any suggestions with integrating the SDGs into sustainability reporting that folks should be aware of?
I would say don't overthink it. I'm speaking from, I would say, a practitioner perspective. And so I would take a pragmatic approach. My advice would be carve out maybe 45 minutes in your calendar, set it aside, make yourself a cup of tea or coffee or whatever you drink, and then just go through and read the targets underneath each of the goals. And I know 169 targets seems quite overwhelming, but they are quick read, and there's some great resources online that lay them out. And I guess identify which targets make the most sense for your scope of work, right? So I'm working from a facilities perspective. So a lot of the SDGs related to education or kind of on the academic side won't be as relevant for my work. And so I would say, don't overthink it, and remember kind of your scope of work or the scope that you're looking at.
Thank you, Amy, and I'll take that on as well. Don't overthink it. Start from where you are. Start from the tools that are available to you. And Jason, do you have any thoughts on key last-minute suggestions or advice for people that might be willing to conduct a 17-room exercise?
Sorry. I'll just say very briefly. It was a super valuable exercise. It took a lot of preparation and planning and the actual meeting time. So it's a big time investment, but the payouts are potentially really strong, and they move you past the just the mapping the landscape. What are we doing? Where are there gaps? It gets you into that work of thinking about what our strengths and priorities are. And the last thing I'll say, I'll be provocative here, and that is that in transitioning to thinking about reporting, my suggestion is don't report on the SDGs. Report on the things that you've determined are important on your campus that you can do to have the most impact in using the SDG framework as the starting point for your considerations. So that's my kind of the last note I'll end on, and look forward to any questions that people may have about the various ways that we've approached this SDG work on the different campuses.
Thank you, Jason. And so now we have a bit of more time for Q&A. And if you feel more comfortable speaking, kindly indicate and I'll unmute you to kind of ask your question. While we're waiting, I think I see 2 questions in the Q&A box right now. And Wendy, this is for you. What was your process of having your college or department help with faculty Scopus ID list? Do you have any answer to that? So Wendy, you have to unmute yourself, please.
Sorry.
No worries.
Yeah, that's the primary question relationship in, using Scopus IDs. How do you keep them up to date? How do you know that they're the right ones? So for this specific exercise, we had a full-time co-op student working with me, and the beginning of the project was he spent weeks making sure that he had all the Scopus IDs correctly attached to the correct faculty members, that he had, we have, there's duplicate names all the time, right? And so he had to deduplicate names, and if it said John Smith, he had to go in and make sure that that Scopus ID was attached to the John Smith and the Faculty of Health at the University of Waterloo. It does take a lot of time and effort to make sure that the Scopus IDs are correct. I'm not going to lie. And that is, if you don't do that, your analysis is not going to be correct. And so that's one reason that if a faculty member had multiple Scopus IDs, even by mistake, we included the multiple IDs in our analysis.
Thank you, Wendy. And I think there's a question here from Sarah. And she wants to know, are there approaches that universities and colleges take in establishing their strategic sustainability priorities? Amy, Jason, do you want to jump in here? How do we establish our strategic sustainability priorities in relation to the SDGs?
I'll just note one method that helped inform the impact agenda that we're developing is effectively a form of heat mapping. And we've seen this in, I think it was St. Joseph's University had this way of displaying activity levels of different SDGs with ways in relation to different kinds of academic activities, from teaching to research and engagement, etc. We did something roughly similar, but tried to document the SDG activities in relation to a whole range of things that include university action plans and office staff and teams and student-led work. And that heat mapping really helped us to identify where there are cross-cutting shared sense of priorities, not just in research intensity and not just in course offerings, but in all the other activities at the university, and use that as a way to inform where are the areas that we have the most potential impact.
Amy, any thoughts on that?
Do you mind just repeating the question? Sorry, I was looking at another question.
No worries. So are there any approaches in establishing sustainability priorities in relation to the SDGs that you know of? And I think there's a second part to that question about key stakeholders and which areas to target them and which areas are more important to the stakeholders.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big question. I can only really sort of share at Bow Valley College. What I found is once we sort of took ownership over reporting the SDGs in what we had control over from a campus services facilities perspective, that has since grown that other departments are now looking at mapping the SDGs. So our applied research team is now mapping our applied research activities to the SDGs. And of course, that has a lot more impacts on our faculty and students in that way. Yeah. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily strategic, but I think sometimes that's how I work is we start and we see where the energy is at, and then we grow from there. And we're now getting a lot of support from our executive team. So I think sometimes being able to show proof of concept of doing it ourselves, then it can help spread across the institution.
That sounds great. So there's a question here about how are the SDGs linked to internal executive reporting requirements of senior leadership? So the provost, the admin, the VP admin, anyone can jump in here. Are the SDGs linked to their reporting for senior VPs within the universities and colleges?
I can talk to what we were doing in engineering. So at the time that our analysis was done, I was working in the engineering research office. So I can't speak for the wider university in relation to this project, but we were very interested in including work on the SDGs in our strategic plan. We currently have a strategic plan from 2020 to 2025, and there's no mention specifically of SDGs or even sustainability in our research plan, in our strategic plan. So the Dean is interested, and I believe in the next iteration of our strategic plan, there will be section around sustainability in the SDGs. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Amy, Jason, any thoughts you'd like to share?
Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, we don't yet have that integration, but that's one of the things that we're hoping to do through the validation of an impact agenda and then the integration into our own internal accountability measures and things like KPIs.
Mm-hmm.
It is actually one of our institutional priorities for this fiscal year to incorporate the SDGs into our applied research. So that did actually come from our executive team. But I would say that directive came after years of engagement with the campus community about the SDGs. So I would say it was sort of a give and take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Please keep your questions coming in the Q&A box. I think one question I would like to ask just before we close is that with the different approaches you have taken on your campuses, have you seen a shift and increased engagement with the SDGs on your campus, or has it kind of plateaued and you just feel like everyone still doesn't know so much about the SDGs? But with your approach, do you think that has kind of increased the engagement with the SDGs on campus? Jason, Amy, please share your thoughts on that.
I'll say just quickly that I think, and this is partly due to the way that we've approached this work, the increased focus and interest is around impact related to sustainability broadly or sustainable development, as opposed to the SDG framework per se.
Mm-hmm.
I can provide an answer to that. I think it was really interesting what happened in engineering. It's been a very, same as what Amy was saying, kind of this iterative, slow process. But last year, for the first time during SDG week, I think beginning of March, we actually had our first SDG event in engineering, and it was a week-long series of different things happening within the faculty, and it was truly amazing to see, especially engineering students go from zero knowledge about SDGs to, by the end of that week, they were spinning this wheel that we had for them, and they had to answer questions about the SDGs, and they were getting little stickers, and to them being able to answer questions about the SDGs. And to me, when I saw that, I was like, wow, this is amazing. Like, these students have gone from knowing nothing to just a small amount of activities that we ran in the lobby of one of our buildings, the busiest building. And now they know, right? And now they can go into their courses with a little bit more understanding of what sustainability is and what the SDGs mean. And it was really obvious to see that difference with those activities. It was great. It was really great.
Yeah, I think it just takes just one person to kind of set the ball rolling, and it kind of spreads like a wildfire, and I love that. Amy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I suppose, and I'll sort of answer a question that I know was answered via text, but maybe I'll just add a little bit of detail around what does SDG related work mean? And I think that's a phrase that I used earlier, was SDG related work. So it's a great question. And I think maybe I'll just share a few examples from my field of work. But I think when we talk about SDG related work, I mean actions or potentially solutions that are enacted by the campus to help solve the challenges that inspired the SDGs in the first place. So I mentioned this one earlier, I think, but target 12.3 is around reducing food waste. And so one of our sustainability staff members is working closely with our catering manager to reduce portion sizes or find ways that we can help reduce food waste being sent for compost. Another one of the targets is 4.7 around all learners acquiring education for sustainable development. Well, we have a campus podcast that talks about that, and the SDGs has been coming up in that podcast a number of times. So I think there's sort of creative ways to see what SDG work is, but ultimately I think it's coming up with solutions or engagement spaces to try and solve the challenges that inspired the goals in the first place. So hopefully that's not too off track here.
Not at all. Thank you, Amy. Wendy, we have one last question for you here. Are there any SDG targets that you'd love to see in your next strategic plan, or any specific learning that will be helpful to direct research priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was it was obvious from our analysis that this might be a good time to pull up the dashboard, but yeah, I might just share my screen. It became obvious from the analysis that there were certain, that's not what you're going to see. What are you seeing right now?
The website.
Yeah, just give me 1 sec.
No problem.
Good now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so this is the sort of an output of our research project. This is a dashboard that's built in Power BI. And Power BI is a really good way for visualizing large amounts of data. So you use these filters on the side. So for example, this first page, our baseline showed our Waterloo count of publications across each SDG, and then that Waterloo share of the Canadian publications. So you can see that we had our highest share in affordable and clean energy, clean water and sanitation, industry and innovation. So these weren't like surprises for us. I think what was surprising is that we had really low counts in quality education, no poverty, gender equality, reduced inequalities. And like, those are SDGs that are not traditionally, we don't think of them as traditionally related to STEM, science, and engineering. So I think it's very important for especially the STEM faculties to think about how their research can be incorporated into these kind of areas and how their research affects these kind of areas, and start conversations around, if we're just a purely STEM faculty, what does that mean? Like, how does our research really have impact on this level? Because these are kind of SDG research that we traditionally see in arts or maybe environment. But I think it's really important for STEM researchers and STEM senior leaders to start thinking about that. Because that's often a conversation in relation to technology and science that isn't had. And I think it's a conversation that should be had. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Wendy. So we have coming close to the hour now, and I just wanted to say a big thank you to all our panelists. That was a very interesting conversation. I did learn a lot from everyone, and a big thank you as well to everyone that was able to join us today. I'm hoping that you feel more inspired and equipped to report on the SDGs on your campus. As a follow-up, we'll be sharing the recording with everyone via email for everyone that registered for the session today. And as mentioned earlier, we'll also be hosting a French session on Wednesday, the 21st of February. And the link to that will be shared with in the email as well. And so please share across your networks for those you think might be interested in the French session. Just a quick note on the SDG Week Canada, that will be on the March the 4th to the 8th this year. And we have now opened up the expression of interest form for you to indicate your participation in this year's, during this year's the week. And in the coming weeks as well, we're opening up the calendar of events for you to kind of upload the types of events that you'll be hosting on your campus. Finally, the ESDC and the SDG unit have opened up a questionnaire for stakeholders and partners across Canada who are working towards achieving the SDGs. And they're seeking your input in preparing for their annual report. So the link also will be shared in the chat box. Please do find some time to fill up the questionnaires, both in English and in French. So thank you so much, everyone. A big thank you to our panelists and all our partners at the University of Canada and CICAN. Thank you so much for joining us today, and do enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.